Now we're moving into the Song dynasty. After the Tang, we have about 60 years of unrest, finally ended by the Song, who will reunify China, or at least China at the time. As you can see, the borders of these dynasties change, so the definition of China really does change over time. And the Song dynasty will introduce civil service exams and thereby remove any hereditary right to civil service jobs. Education comes to prominence. They will also invent the magnetic compass, moving clay type, printing, paper money, and gunpowder. In fact, as the Song come into power at the end of the second millennium, about 1000 CE, or the year 1000, let's do a quick comparison. In Europe, they believe that water makes you sick, and therefore most people bathe about twice in their life, usually on their wedding day and one other time. In Europe, they're living with animals inside. They have no concept of paper money. There is no printing press. They do have compasses. They do not have gunpowder. Had I dropped you in the world between the two, Europe and China, at this time in the year 1000, when Europe is convinced that the world is about to end, that the apocalypse is upon them, you would have chosen China as the likely winner. In fact, up to 1400, you would probably do the same thing. So it is a very different culture. I'm just trying to give you an idea of what sort of time frame we're dealing with. And we're looking at Kuan and Chinese painting in general. And there are two things I want to point out. Actually, a few. First of all, many of these paintings are done on silk rather than paper. And many of them are done in ink. Basically, you could think of it as painting on with watercolor on fabric. And you can imagine how difficult that is to controlling the bleed specifically. Then there are a couple of aspects that people tend to get confused about. First of all, we have these red colophons, or stamps. And these can serve a couple of purposes. First of all, it could be the artist's name under certain circumstances, but it's often the collector's name. So the collector might be stamping it, showing that they at one time owned it. You can imagine signing a Van Gogh on the front just to show that you owned it at one point. Then we have what is frequently poetry. And this could be written by the artist. Frequently, in the case of literati artists, who we'll come across a little bit later, it might be something telling of the circumstance for that painting. Now, it could also be a collector who's writing a poem to the painting and writing it directly on the painting. Now, these are very foreign ideas to our Western concepts of art, but they are very common in China. Now, Kuan himself is a Taoist recluse. He believed that nature, not other artists, was the best teacher. And he was known as the first master of light, shade, texture, and distance. But he's a little different. He sought to capture the essence of nature. He sought to paint a tribute to nature, not a representation of a specific scene. This is unusual because in the West, we tend to think of artists creating a specific image. This is actually because of Dutch landowners in the 17th century. But getting away from that bit of history, Kuan is actually very similar to a modern artist many of you are familiar with. Sorry, wrong slide. Bob Ross. Because Bob Ross, when he paints, isn't painting a specific image. He's painting a mountain, a tree, a landscape, a river, and combining those elements. He's not painting something particularly specific. He's not saying, if you stand in this spot, you will see this image. That's exactly what Kuan is doing. He's taking elements of nature, putting them together for the betterment of his narrative, for the betterment of his story. And he paints Traveler Among Mountains and Streams. And this is actually a vertical landscape of massive size. It's about 7 feet long. And here we see these incredible mountains rising into the distance. In fact, nature dwarfs the humans. That looks like a smudge, maybe in the middle of a river, that's our travelers. Here we look at in great detail, and you can make out the pack animals and someone traveling behind them. So why does it do this? Why did Kuan do this? Well, what he's trying to do is get across the grandeur of nature and the smallness of people, that people are, at an individual level, irrelevant, that we are temporary, that you're going to die, and when you do, for the most part, you're not going to leave much of a mark on the earth itself. And we get that sense from the scale of nature massively dwarfing our travelers. In America, we'll see something similar in the Hudson River School of Painting, although there it's referred to as transcendentalism. So reminding us of our smallness as opposed to the grandeur of nature itself. Also, the size of the scroll, it's 7 feet long. This gives you the idea of this incredible scale of nature, and yet the scroll, even at that size, cannot contain the grandeur of nature. The perspective is varied as well. Some areas are seen from the ground, while others are seen from above. Now, what do I mean? Well, as we look at it, and I'm going to pull up my pen again, the mountains here, it looks like we're up above the mountains. So we're in a drone or an airplane looking slightly down. But yet down here, it looks like we're standing behind these rocks, like we're at ground level, simply looking across the ground. So we've got two different perspectives, one looking more or less level across, and one looking downwards at these mountains. And he's doing this because perspective is irrelevant. It's not about perspective. It's not about creating something particularly realistic. It is about getting across the theme or idea, which is the grandeur of nature and the smallness of man. Now, he uses texture in his brushstrokes to model these massive forms and create a very tactile sort of surface. From the Chinese perspective, one of the things that you look at in these paintings to really appreciate them is the brushwork. And they look at the brushwork much the same way that they look at calligraphy. In fact, to them, it's more or less the same thing. It's the ability to control ink and to control the brush. If you don't have that control, you're not going to be able to create images like this, where he is so effectively creating very sharp surfaces, but also these massive gradients where we seem to have a haze rising at the base of the mountains. I mean, consider the amount of control that goes into that. And he can't erase if he makes a mistake. He simply has to continue or simply destroy the image. So it truly is really remarkable.